In the dry summer of 1885, in the sandhill country of Cherry County, Nebraska, a rancher named Elias Wardle dug his well 20 feet deeper for the fourth year running, and before the men at the Antelope Springs Cafe had poured their second cup, the whole valley knew he had gone down after water again, like a man arguing with the earth itself. He hauled it up by the barrel to a stock tank that still stood dry and cracked by the middle of August, and he watched his grass burn to nothing under him and his cattle walk the weight off their own bones. And the young schoolteacher who boarded at his ranch that summer scraped one long, low ditch across the flat that he laughed at and called making mud, and 2 summers on, when the drought came down on the county and burned every open range for 30 miles to gray straw and emptied every tank but hers was the only green grass left standing for miles. She had not gone soft in the head. She had read a thing in the lay of the land that not one of those men had ever stooped low enough to see. Picture Elias first, because you would have rooted for him even while you wanted to shake him. He was a big, sun-blasted man in his 40s, lean and hard through the shoulders from a life of lifting, with a face gone to leather under a tan hat he wore pushed back off his forehead, and a dusty brown work shirt washed so many times it had given up its color to the sun. His hands were the size of dinner plates and cracked at every knuckle. When he stood on his own range and looked out over it, he would push that hat back and set one hand on his hip and squint at the horizon like it owed him something, and mostly he believed it did, because Elias Wardell believed with his whole stubborn heart that the answer to dry country was to go straight down after the water. His father had dug for it. His grandfather in Ohio had dug for it. Water was under your feet, and a man of grit and a good back went and got it. That was the whole of his religion, and there is one of these stories in every dry county in America. And the country he believed it on was the Sand Hills, that great rolling ocean of grass-covered dunes where the rain comes when it pleases and leaves when it pleases, and a man's whole fortune rides on whether the grass holds through August. Elias ran a home flat below his weathered gray house, a broad, hard pan of buffalo wallow ground packed flat and slick as a threshing floor by 10,000 years of hooves. Every spring the snowmelt came off the hills and the rains came down, and every spring that water hit the hard flat and sheeted off it and ran away down the draw in a brown hurry, gone to the river before noon. And Elias never once looked at it going. He was looking down. He was always looking down. The teacher's name was Margaret Ainsley, and she had come out from Illinois on the spring stage to keep the little sod school through the summer term, and she boarded at the Wardell place because it was the nearest roof with a spare room. She was a young woman, not much past her middle 20s, with a mass of auburn hair she pinned up under a plain straw hat with a shallow brim to keep the sun off, and a fair freckled face that had not yet learned to stop coloring in that hard light. She had keen, steady eyes the color of shallow water, hazel going to blue, and a quiet mouth that did not say much and missed nothing. She wore a denim blue day dress, plain and well made, the sleeves buttoned neat at the wrist and the bodice fitted close, and she moved over that broken ground, careful and light, watching where the water had been. That was the thing about Margaret Ainsley. Everybody in that valley looked at the sky. She looked at the ground. And the reason she looked at the ground was a notebook, and it is worth holding on to that notebook because it is the whole story. It was a slim thing bound in dark oilcloth, the kind a surveyor carries, and her father had been a canal man back in Illinois, a leveler and a ditch runner who read the fall of land like other men read Scripture, and he had filled that book alongside her, teaching her from the time she could walk, and then he had died and left her the book and the eye he had trained. In it, in a pencil hand going soft at the edges, were grade lines and level marks and a thing he had copied out of an almanac and an old irrigation report, how the dry country people out west, the ones who farmed without rain, held their spring water not by penning it up behind a high dam, but by slowing it down. She read it at night by the lamp while Elias mended tack. She said nothing. She watched his flat sheet its water away for a month before she spoke one word about it. When she finally spoke, they were standing at the edge of that home flat in the evening, and the stock tank behind them was a bowl of dried mud with the cracks curling up. "You are chasing the water in the wrong direction," she said. Elias came up out of the well hole gray with grit and wiped his face and looked at her. "Beg pardon? The water you need comes free off those hills every spring, and you let every drop of it run away down the draw. You could hold it, not pen it. Slow it." She turned and pointed her chin at the flat, one long, low bank of earth across there. No pond, no wall, just enough grade to slow the runoff to a crawl and let it soak sideways into the ground. Your grass would drink from underneath all summer. He looked at her the way a man looks at a child who has told him how to shoe a horse. Then he looked at the well hole he had been killing himself in for 4 years, and he laughed. Not cruel, just certain. "Water runs downhill. Teacher," he said, "no ditch ever made grass." "My father made 2,000 acres of it," she said, and went in to trim the lamp. That night he sat at the kitchen table with his supper going cold and watched her open the oilcloth book and draw a long, shallow curve across a rough sketch of his own flat. He got up and stood behind her chair. "That is not a dam," he said. "That is a scratch. A dam holds water up where you can see it and lose it to the sun and the seep," she said, not turning around. "This holds it down where the grass can find it. My father used to say the smartest dam is the one a stranger cannot see." She tapped the pencil twice on the page. "You are not too proud to be shown, Mr. Wardle. You are only too proud to have been wrong for 4 years running." He did not answer that. He went out and stood by the dry tank in the dark a long while. And when he came in, he did not say yes. But he did not take the lamp from her either. But she boarded there through August, and she was patient as still water, and there was not much else for the crew to do in the dead heat, so at last, to get some peace and maybe to prove her wrong, Elias told 2 of the hands to take the Fresno scrapers and the team and give the school teacher her mud. You have never seen work look so much like foolishness. She would not let them build it high. Every man's instinct on that crew was to throw up a good dam, a real dam, a thing a fellow could stand on and be proud of, and every time they piled it, she made them spread it back down, low and long and almost level, following a line she paced off and marked with little stakes and a string weighted with a rock. Higher, the older hand, Pruitt, kept saying, "Ma'am, a dam's gotta hold something." "This one holds nothing," she said, on her knees in the dirt with her level. "That is the point of it. Take it down another hand's width." Pruitt spat and looked at the other man and took it down. She walked that string on her knees in her denim blue dress gone brown at the hem, her straw hat pushed back and the freckles standing out on her nose, laying one hand flat on the raw, scraped earth to feel the fall of it, and the hands stood on their scrapers and shook their heads. It did not pond anything. It did not hold back a flood. It just lay there across the flat, a long, low, curving ridge of turned dirt maybe knee-high, running crossways to the fall of the land like a wrinkle in a blanket. The men at the Antelope Springs Cafe heard about it inside a week. They called it the schoolmarm's ditch. They called her the schoolmarm engineer, and they said it grinning over their coffee. Elias sat in that cafe and took the ribbing on his chin and did not much defend it, because privately he agreed with them, and the only reason it stayed was that it had cost him almost nothing but the laughing. Now here is the part to sit with, because this is where most men would have graded the whole thing flat and gone back down the well. The first spring after they built it, the runoff came off the hills as it always did, and it hit her low bank and slowed and spread and stood in a wide, thin sheet for a day, and then it was gone into the ground, and by June the flat was a little greener. That was all. A little greener a little later into the summer than the burned ground beyond it. It was no miracle. It saved nobody. Pruitt walked it in June and reported to the crew that the ditch had done nothing worth the digging, and the cafe men allowed that a wet enough spring will green any low spot, dam or no dam, and they were not entirely wrong, because it had been an ordinary year with ordinary rain, and an ordinary year hides the truth of a thing like that. Even Margaret went quiet along that flat that June, laying her hand on the grass and frowning, because a little greener is a thin thing to have staked your name on in front of a whole valley. But the teacher's term ended that fall, and she did not go back to Illinois. There was a new term and a room at the Wardell place, and a long, low ditch she wanted to watch through another spring. And if we are honest, there was Elias, too, who had stopped laughing at her by then, even if he had not started believing her, and who had taken to walking that flat in the evenings with his hat held down at his side instead of pushed back on his head. That was the winter he nearly ended the whole thing. Staring down another dry spring, and short of hands, and short of hope. He stood out on the raw, scraped flat in the cold March wind and said it as gentle as he could. "Margaret, I mean to run the scrapers over it come spring. Grade it level and put it to a proper crop." He would not look at her. 2 springs of a little greener is not worth the looks I take in town. A man cannot farm on the word of an almanac. She did not raise her voice. She took the oilcloth notebook out of her coat and opened it to the penciled curve her father had left her and laid her flat hand on the page. "One more spring," she said. "Let it bank one more runoff before you rub out what my father spent his life learning." Just the one, Elias. He looked at her hand on that book and at the well hole he had fought for 5 years, and something in him gave. "One," he said, "one more." And that was the spring the rain did not come. It came up dry out of the winter, dry through March, dry through the planting that nobody dared to plant. The runoff that spring was thin and quick, a brown trickle off the hills, and her low bank slowed even that little and spread it and let it soak. And then the sky closed like a lid. April went by on a wind that smelled of dust. May burned. By the middle of June, the whole of Cherry County knew what it had on its hands, and by July it had a name for it, and men who had laughed at a school-teacher's ditch were not laughing at anything. The grass on the open range cured standing and went from green to yellow to a dead pale gray, and then it broke off at the root and blew. The stock tanks went to cracked mud, Elias's among them, well and all, because you cannot haul a barrel fast enough to water a herd against a sky like that. The heat came up off the flats in a shimmer you could see the horizon swim through, Cattle bawled at dry ground and walked the fences and walked the weight off, and out on the county roads the dust of the sell-off hung in the air, because the neighbors were hauling their starving stock to the railhead and taking whatever the buyers cared to give, which was next to nothing, because everybody was selling at once. It was the kind of summer the old people talk about for 50 years. It was the villain of this whole story, and it did not spare one open acre in that county. But nobody has said yet how the low bank works, and now, with the county burning, is when it finally shows. All through those 2 ordinary springs and this one thin, dry one, her long, low, almost level ridge had done the single quiet thing it was built to do. It never held a pond a man could see. What it did was catch the spring runoff as it sheeted down the hard flat and slow it to a standstill, so that instead of racing off down the draw in half a day, it lay there and had time to sink down through the packed buffalo wallow ground and outward, spreading under the whole flat into the shallow layer of sand that the grass roots run in. Year on year, it had been charging that shallow water like a man filling a cistern he could not see, soaking it in from the top and letting the ground hold it below. And grass, it turns out, does not drink from the clouds. Grass drinks from that shallow water under its own roots. So while the open range above the flat had nothing under it but dust and reached down with dying roots into nothing, the meadow on her flat reached down a foot or 2 and found water, her banked water. Last spring's runoff and the spring before held in the ground where no sun could take it. It was not irrigation a man could point at. It was the whole flat quietly drinking from beneath. The dry country people out west had a name for it that Margaret's father had penciled in the book. They called it sub-irrigation, and a near-level spreader bank was how you built it. And not one man with a well rig in Cherry County had ever thought to hold his water on top of the ground instead of chasing it beneath. See it through the eyes of a ruined man, because that is the only honest way to tell it. There was a neighbor to the south named Harmon Cobb, a hard, patient man who had watched the Wardell place through 5 dry years, waiting for the day the bank would take it and the deep home flat would come cheap. Cobb had sold 60 head that July at a loss that broke him, and he came up the county road in the worst of the heat to see whether Elias was ready to talk about the land at last. He stopped his wagon at the top of the rise above the home flat, and he took off his hat. And he did not put it back on for a long while. Below him the whole county lay gray to the horizon, a dead, shimmering gray tan, the buttes swimming in heat, not one green thing in 30 miles, and then that low curving bank of earth, and beyond it, a meadow, green, standing green grass, deep enough to hide a calf's knees, running clear back to the gray house, and Wardell cattle down in it with their heads lowered and their sides filling out, fat and slick and grazing easy in the one green field left in the world. Cobb sat there holding that hat against his chest and looked at the schoolmarm's ditch a long time. When he climbed down at the gate, all he could get out was, "How? Wardell, how? In God's name?" And there was Margaret at the edge of it, in the last hour of the light, in her denim blue dress with the sleeves buttoned to the wrist and her straw hat pushed back off her auburn hair, crouched at the grass line with one bare hand laid flat on the green, feeling for the cool of it her father's grade lines come true in the ground. And Elias stood out on the burned side, on the dead gray range, his tan hat pushed back and his hand come up to the brim without his knowing it, staring across that low bank at the fat cattle and the standing grass. He did not say anything. There was nothing a man could say. Cobb turned to him and asked it again, low, and Elias only shook his head and nodded at Margaret and said, "Ask her." It was never me. It was never once me. The reckoning came quiet, as it ought to. There was a stockmen's meeting in the county hall at the end of that terrible August. Ranchers, half of them ruined, come together to count the dead and ask what could be done, and a man near the back rose and put it to Elias Wardell straight. "Wardell, your home flat held green through the whole of it. Every acre I own is gray. I have known you 15 years, and I never took you for a lucky man. So how?" Here is the soul of how this ends. Elias did not stand up and tell that room what they could do with their laughing. There is no scene in this story where he settles the score. He stood up slow, turning his hat in his cracked hands, and he said it plain. It was not my doing. I spent 5 years going straight down after water, and I never once got it. A schoolteacher who boards at my place read the lay of my own land better in one summer than I read it in a lifetime of standing on it. He looked out over them. Her name is Margaret Ainsley. Her father was a canal man in Illinois, and she has a book of his grade lines. She showed me you hold the spring water on top and let the ground drink it slow. There is no patent on it and no secret but the stooping to look. Go and walk the bank yourselves. Build your own. He sat back down. The drought is what ruined us, boys, not one man in this room. And a woman none of you would hire kept my herd fat while I dug a dry hole. The drought was the villain in that hall. Not one man in it was made so, not even Cobb, and Elias gave the credit away entire. And a roomful of hard men sat still and took it, and that was the vindication, not that he won, but that they finally saw. They came to the fence after that, as they always do. They came with their hats in their hands to walk the low bank and pace it off and squint at the fall of the land. And the county surveyor copied her level marks down into his own book, and within 3 springs there were low spreader banks going in on flats all up and down that valley, and the men who built them called them by their right name at last and not by a joke. The dry country agents from the college came out years on and wrote it up, the sub-irrigated meadow on the Wardell Flat, and put a proper name to what a canal man had penciled into an oilcloth book by lamplight, and the name stuck and the bank spread and outlived every man who had laughed. Harmon Cobb kept his land. He came and asked to be shown, plain and humble, and Elias showed him, and Cobb graded a bank across his own south flat, and it held him through the next dry year. And a man's ruin turned back into a neighbor, which is a better ending than the one Cobb had come up that road looking to give. Elias regraded his whole home flat to her ditch, took the Fresno scrapers he had once lent her as a joke, and ran low spreader banks clear across every acre of it, following her stakes and her string and her flat hand on the ground, and gave up going down the well for good. He married the schoolteacher that fall, which will not surprise you, in the little sod school where she had kept her terms. And she never did go back to Illinois. And the oilcloth notebook did not go on a shelf. She kept writing in it the grade lines and the level marks, and now the wet years and the dry ones, and how deep the shallow water stood under the flat come August, her father's hand and then her own, filling the book so the knowing would not die with the man who did the digging. That is the part worth carrying out of here. The grass came back every spring on that flat, green to the frost, drinking from underneath in the driest of years, and the reason it did was that a young woman in a denim blue dress had knelt in the dirt and read a hard flat that 100 men had walked across and never once looked down at. If you have ever brought back a way of doing things that everybody told you to grade flat and forget, something an old man taught you, penciled in a book, laughed at in town, then you already understand why this story is worth the telling. Tell us in the comments, would you have dug the well deeper like Elias or trusted the schoolteacher's ditch? And where in the country are you listening from tonight?